Okay, so today we're going to be talking about gymnosperms, also known as the group Pinophyta. So we saw these actually before, a certain group of them, the conifers, when we were learning about our dichotomous species. So when we have lab on Thursday, you definitely recognize some of the specimens if you remember that lab. We'll be expanding though, because Pinophyta includes groups that are not conifers, although that is the largest group within the gymnosperms. Okay. So a little bit of background about where these gymnosperms come from. Phylogenies get a little messy within gymnosperms, within plants in general, as we have mentioned a couple times before. But gymnosperms are considered one of the two divisions of seed-bearing plants. So up until now, we separate out the bryophytes, the mosses, because they're not vascular, so we didn't look at them. And last time we talked about ferns and fern allies. Their special reproduction method is through spores. So now we're moving on to seed-bearing plants. So the seed-bearing plants, or spermatophytes, are going to have two types: the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, which we'll talk about next week. So when we look at the gymnosperms, we're going to see that their reproductive system is based around these structures called cones. Cones are just a specialized form of strobilus, which we saw before in some of our fern allies. Okay, like for example, when we looked at our horsetails and some of our club mosses, we saw those sort of cone-like structures on the tips where we had the spores and sporangia collecting within the strobilus. So when we think about pine cones and pollen cones, those are that same type of structure. They're really related to that structure. So if we think about how these groups are related to each other, this is one idea, right? We first have our radiation of vascular plants. So we start to see xylem and phloem. Then we break off our ferns and fern allies over here, because they just have spores. Then we see the development of seeds. We're going to see that the gymnosperm technically means naked seed. So the way we're going to know that something is a gymnosperm when we're looking at its reproductive structures is that it's not going to have a fruit structure around it, basically. Our angiosperms are flowering plants. So when you buy fruit at the grocery store, it's around seeds and pits. Those are angiosperms. Our gymnosperms have their seeds in cones or some other slightly weird structures. We'll get to those exceptions when we see them. But they don't have fruit as such. So we're going to go through 4 classes within this. So we're going to talk about the Pinophyta, the Gymnosperms, the Catophyta, and the Metophyta or Metate. We're going to see some examples of each of these groups and talk about some cool things that they do. Before we do that, I do want to just briefly talk about what a seed is, because thus far we've only talked about spores. So saying that gymnosperms are one of our 2 groups of seed plants helps to know what a seed is. So when we talk about the reproduction of the gymnosperms, we're actually going to see that spores still are involved. But when we fertilize our gymnosperms, when the spores fertilize each other, we're going to get a plant embryo that's enclosed in a protective outer covering. So that's really what a seed is. It's actually an embryo that has this protective covering that protects it from mainly desiccation, right? But other types of damage as well. But as seeds dry out, right, they don't die off. We can have really, really, really old seeds that still germinate, that still sprout. And that's partially because of this protective covering. So when we say a gymnosperm is a naked seeded plant, what we mean is that when we look at angiosperms, and we'll talk about their structures next week, In angiosperms, the seed is surrounded by the plant's ovary. Gymnosperms don't do that. So we're going to see the seeds contained in cones, but we're not going to see this fleshy structure around the seed. Okay. So since we're about to talk about reproduction again, it's helpful to remember some of the things we looked at in our fern lab last time. Okay. So when we think about gymnosperm reproduction, we're still going to be thinking about sporophytes and gametocytes. So when we see a gymnosperm tree, like when you look at a pine tree, that's a sporophyte. That's the sporophyte of a pine. Gymnosperms are what we consider heterosporous, and we'll see that in angiosperms as well, which means that they're going to produce both male and female spores. So we saw in some of our ferns that we just produce a spore and it becomes a gametophyte. In gymnosperms, we're specifically going to be producing microspores, which are male spores, and megaspores, which are female spores. So we have these two types of structures, and we're going to see two different types of cones on our plants, actually. So the microspores are located in microsporicles, and we're going to see that in a lot of these plants that are contained in pollen cones. We'll take a look at one of those in a second. But this is going to develop into the male gametophyte, which has to fertilize the female gametophyte in order to create our diploid sporophyte. So the megasporophylls are going to be found in our female cones. They're producing megaspores, female spores, leading to those female gametophytes. When we talk about cones, that's our typical English word. We can also call them astragalus. So like when we were looking at the horsetails and our club mosses, astragalus is a mass, so like a group of scales or bracts. A bract is a modified leaf that contain reproductive structures, namely these microspores and megaspores. Okay. We're going to take a look at a male astragalus or a pollen cone. So this is the male reproductive structure of our gymnosperm. Now, when we're thinking about gymnosperms, when we're thinking about trees, some trees are going to have both male and female reproductive structures on the same tree. And some trees are going to have specifically this pine tree over there is a male tree, this pine tree over there is a female tree, something like that. If there are male and female trees, different trees, we call them dioecious, di for two. If we find both male and female cones on the same tree, we call them monoecious, mono for one, because they're on one tree. If we have a monoecious tree, usually the male cones, the pollen cones, are higher up, so that when they release their pollen, the pollen falls down onto the female cones and is able to spread farther out away from the tree. So here on the right, check my right from left, we see the pollen cone. The pollen cone is going to look like this. And if we see them out in the wild, we're going to feel that they often feel kind of soft, right? They don't feel like your typical pine cone. You might not even think of them as a cone at all. You might think they look kind of like a flower. Okay? But if we cut them in half, we're going to see we have these modified leaves, these bracts or scales. Those are our microsporophylls. Phil tells us it's the leaf. Okay. Almost anytime we see a pH, we should be suspecting it has something to do with a leaf or at least a plant. And here we see the microsporangia, so those small spores are the mother cells that are producing the spores. So that is what we would see if we cut one of these pollen cones in half. Now, when we look at the female astragalus, we can also call these ovulate cones. So your typical pine cone that you see, that's the female structure, that hard wood structure. So when we look at a diagram of an ovulate cone, we're going to see that we have, again, scales. So they could be considered bracts. These are megasporophylls. And at the base of these scales, we have our ovules. So this is where we see the ovule in a pine cone. So here we see histological slides of pine cones. So here's what they look like if you picked them off a tree. If you tried my candied pine cones, this is actually what you were eating, that female pine cone, that ovulate cone, before it had opened up and fertilized. Okay, so here we can see the scales, and we can see the ovules compared to the male cone. Right, looks a little fleshier, looks a little softer. We can see those microsporangia, smaller, lots of them. Okay. So when the ovulate cone, the female cone, gets fertilized, we're going to see that the seed is developing there where the ovule was on the unfertilized female cone. So we're going to form the seeds inside these scales here. So theoretically, you could shake a fertilized pine cone and shake those nuts out. If you've ever had like pine nuts, that's where they're coming from. They're coming from inside the cone. So now we're going to look at the life cycle as a whole. So they're heterosporous, so we have to think about both the male structures and the female structures. We can trace them on either side. So here on the left, we have the male structures. So our mature diploid sporophyte is the tree. Diploid sporophyte. The male structure is the pollen cone. So these are little fleshy cones, almost look like flowers, but these are not angiosperms, so these are not technically flowers. In the pollen cone, we have microsporangia producing our male spores. After meiosis happens, our pollen is the release of those male spores. These then produce the gametophytes, which form wings and tube cells and get themselves into the female cone using something called a pollen tube. So let's go over to the female side next. So on the female side, we're producing an ovulate cone. So that's our female structure. If we were to pull off one of these scales, a single scale, we would see an ovary, ovule, sorry, at the bottom. So that's our location for meiosis in the ovulate cone. So here we see our megaspore, and we see that developing female gametophyte inside. So that female gametophyte, we've seen this word before, archegonia. So this is that female structure that's developing here. And this is what we consider basically the egg of our gymnosperm. So this is where the fertilization is going to occur, at which point we're forming the plant embryo. Right? After fertilization, we're recreating that diploid state. So we had two haploid things coming together. And as the embryo grows, it forms a seed, so it has a protective coating. And often we're also going to see a wing in order to let them float away from the sporophyte so that it's spreading out, not all in one space, not competing with each other too much. So questions about this life cycle for the male versus female cones? All right, so in that case, we're going to go into the groups. We're talking our classes of gymnosperms. So the first one we're going to talk about are the Penopsida. These are our conifers. They're the most abundant group. You see Penopsida all over Minnesota. We have some out on our front lawn. As you saw, we went out and looked at the spruces and the pines that we have outside. And the Penopsida are all going to be woody plants, meaning that wood, it's not going to die back in winter. They're mostly trees. There are a couple of shrubs. The majority of them are evergreen, meaning they're not going to lose their leaves on an annual basis. They're going to lose them one by one here and there as they replace them. We will see a couple of cool exceptions, but the vast majority are keeping, keeping their leaves year round. If you encounter Pinopsida conifers out in the forest and you touch them and you try to pick some pine cones, right? You want to make your own candy pine cones. You're going to notice that they have this resin within them. So this sticky sort of fluid. This protects them against infection, both from insects getting in or from wounds, protects against fungal infections as well. The cool thing about resin is that we have a bunch of fossilized resin as well. Amber is technically fossilized resin. So if you have any amber jewelry, you are wearing part of this conifer. Amber is also cool because sometimes it's trapped the bugs that got stuck in that resin. So we can see really ancient organisms for them. Pinopsida are also cool because they have a lot of really outstanding examples. The tallest tree is a conifer, the widest tree is a conifer, the oldest tree is a conifer. And we're going to take a look at them because they're amazing. Bless you. Oh, before we do that, I should say that we looked at a lot of examples of conifers in lab the other day, but there are three families you should be most familiar with because they have common names and we see a lot of them around here. So those would be the firs, the spruces, and the pines. So those are the genera Abies, Picea, and Pinus. And the way we can tell them apart is by looking at those needles. So when we're talking about a pine tree, like the genus of pine trees, we're going to see long, soft needles that grow in bunches. If you ever pick pine needles and they're in a bunch, you are looking at a pine. So they're going to be in groups of 2 to 5 in these clusters. The spruces and the firs are a little harder to tell apart. They're going to have smaller needles. They're going to look pretty similar if you look at them from afar. The best way to tell the spruces and the firs apart is to try to kind of roll a needle between your fingers. It should be much harder to do with a fir. It should be easier to do with a spruce because the firs have two-sided needles that are one. So they have just like a top and a bottom. Whereas the spruces are going to have rounded or square needles. They technically have 4 sides. When we look at the branches, we'll also see that those needles are coming off in slightly different patterns. The spruce needles are going to be coming off kind of in a star shape, whereas when we're looking at the firs, they're going to be growing just kind of on the tops and sides of the branch. So overall, firs look a little flatter in a bunch of different ways than the spruces do. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the record-breaking conifers, because I think they are super cool. So our tallest tree is a coast redwood. So the genus Sequoia, species Sempervirens. It's 379 feet tall. Okay, so here we see a depiction of some heights. Right? They've gone all the way from this random guy, Dave, who they claim is relatively tall, all the way up to Hyperion. So we can see it's bigger than Big Ben. It's bigger than a space shuttle. Really, really tall. Estimates for how old it is, about 600 to 800 years old. So we're going to see that our conifers are often quite old. In Gymnosperms as a whole, we're going to see a lot of really old examples. They're relatively long-lived plants. Cool thing about Hyperion is you may see, like on social media, pictures claiming that they're of the tallest tree. They are not of the tallest tree. Hyperion's location is actually a secret. They do not want you to go find this tree specifically. They want to protect it. They don't want you to go bother it. So we know it exists. We know they recorded how tall it is, but it's not supposed to be a tourist attraction. That'll be true of a number of these kind of record-breaking trees. But there are a lot of ways you can measure how big something is, right? So Hyperion is really tall. right? So that's one way something can be big, but we could also think about the widest tree. So widest in diameter. They used to think looking at this tree, which is called the Arbre de Toulet, that's its name. It's a Montezuma cypress. They used to think it was a bunch of trees that grew together, because that does happen in plants where you have several trees, several trunks that kind of fuse as they grow. But they did DNA tests on this tree. It is just one tree, all has the same DNA. Almost 140 feet in diameter, and has really wide-ranging estimates on how old it is. Nobody is planning to cut it down and, you know, count its rings, right? So anywhere from 1,200 to 6,000 years old. But the locals say it was planted 1,400 years ago by an Aztec priest. It's pretty cool. It's on the current site of a Roman Catholic church, so that also lends some credence to the idea that it was a priest who planted this. We could measure a tree by volume. So when we think about big trees, we often think about the giant sequoias, because they have giant in their name, right? So here we have General Sherman is our biggest tree by volume, somewhere in the 2,000 to 3,000 year old range. Yeah, super, super old. And the cool thing about this tree is that I heard a lot about forest fires in the West, right? I mean, all over the place, but especially out West. So this tree, because this one is a tourist attraction and it's important to people, I actually wrapped it in kind of a specialized form of aluminum foil to protect it from the fires around it, to stop it from burning. So that's what you see happening here. I think they've taken it down since, but who knows, maybe they put it back up whenever they're worried. So this tree is the biggest by volume. So this includes both the height and the width together. Yeah, it seems like they could have gone with a ladder, but you know, you use what you got. So here's some other giant sequoias. They're not record breaking, but they are really cool. So in the 18 and 1900s, they went through a fad, which was building tunnels in giant sequoias, which seems like a kind of cool fad. A fair number of these trees have died or fallen down or been damaged. So this one you can see I have no idea what car that is. I don't know anything about cars. But this one we see a car driving through. That one came down in the 1960s, I think. As you can see, this one was published in 2017. That's when this one died. But there are still two that you can go through. This fallen log you could go through. This is in Sequoia National Park. If you hiked out to the Tuolumne Grove in Yosemite, this tree is technically dead, but it's still standing. So you could still walk through it, ride a bike through it. So if you're looking for vacation ideas, you want to get a picture with a cool tree standing inside a tree, try it. Now, the fact that the ones we have right now are dead is not reflective of the fact that we didn't kill them by building these tunnels through. They were still able to get nutrients and cycle them around using the vascular tissue on either side. Really just that they're old and we're not digging any holes in the trees, basically. Or at least as far as I know. The oldest tree, still a conifer. Right? We're still in the same group. This is a tree called Methuselah. Its location is also a secret, but it's somewhere in California or maybe Nevada. And it's confirmed to be at least 4,855 years old. They estimate that it germinated, so created this sporophyte in 2833 BC. A really long time, and it's still going, right? There used to be an older tree, which is a kind of sad story. Prometheus used to be the oldest tree, but one day a grad student working for the Forest Service was out taking samples of trees and taking cores, and he got his drill stuck in the tree, cut it down to get the drill out, and then started counting the rings and realized it was the oldest tree. Uh, so I don't know if that's an argument for keeping Methuselah's location secret or an argument against it, because it seems like if you had a list, you'd know. But yeah, they don't want that to happen again. Secrets, more tree secrets. Can you imagine if you were that grad student? Oh. Right, that's the part that should be a secret. Another cool story about conifers is there was a tree called the Dawn redwood that was really prevalent in North America starting like 65 million years ago. But for, I don't know, like a really long time, they thought it was extinct. It's been gone from North America for ages and ages. So they thought it was extinct. Some guy found fossils of it, so they knew it existed. And then they found one single tree out in a shrine in a really distant part of China. So sparsely inhabited this valley, kind of in central China. It took them a while to figure out that this fossil tree that they thought was extinct and this big tree in a shrine in China they found were the same thing. But once they did, everybody was really excited. So they redistributed it to botanical gardens. And you can see them around today. There are lots of botanical gardens have examples. A cool thing about this tree is that while most of our conifers are evergreen rather than deciduous, the Dawn redwood actually does change colors and drop its leaves annually. So here we see Dawn redwood in the spring with its green leaves, and here we see it ready to drop those leaves, those needles in the fall. They turn this cool reddish color. Now we're finally on to our next group. So this is our next class of Gymnosperms. This is the Ginkgoopsida, and there's actually only one species. So the Ginkgo biloba is our one example of this class. And it's often considered a living fossil. People say it hasn't really changed for about 200 million years. Like a bunch of our conifers, it's a dioecious plant. So this means that there are male trees and female trees. Right. The male trees are a relatively common street tree. They started planting them in like the 1800s when they were having lots of issues with smog, right? They found that planting plants cleared the air. The male trees are pretty. They have these cool leaves. They turn yellow in the fall. They're really nice. The female trees are also really pretty, but they have some really horrible smelling berries. And I can confirm this. When I was in grad school, there was a female ginkgo tree around the corner from my apartment, and I thought I had dog poop on my shoes for like a month. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So they have these horrible, horrible smelling berries. And it is weird that they have berries, so they are still gymnosperms. But if you were to look at a female ginkgo tree, you might think it was an angiosperm because it has a fruit, or it has what looks like a fruit. Technically, it's not a fertilized plant ovary, so it doesn't count. But it's deceptive. We'll have some deceptive structures within these next couple of groups. The problem is about planting these male trees instead of female trees, because I figured, they're pretty, it's fine, we just won't plant the female ones. Rarely, but enough to make a difference, branches on these trees can spontaneously change sex. I don't know how it works, and I'm not sure anybody knows how it works, but it's kind of an unfortunate problem if you're a city planner and you're planting a tree and you're like, okay, this is a good male ginkgo tree, to realize that in, say 30 years or whatever, it may suddenly start producing these horrible, horrible fruits. They are a good street tree though, because they live a really long time, like a lot of other gymnosperms. They're pretty cheap to plant. They don't require much upkeep, and people like them because they're pretty, so they do still plant them. Another issue with the male versus female problem is that when they started planting them, they didn't really realize this issue of the male and female trees. They did it by grafting. So grafting is where you take like a piece of a tree and you bind it on to another tree, like a little stump of it. So some of these grafts, they were using female trees as their like root stock. So they think that that's part of some of the problems. So those are cool. Okay. Next, we have what looks like a palm tree. So we saw ferns that look like palm trees. Now we're seeing gymnosperms that look like palm trees. Not a palm tree though. So this is a cycad. Cycads have a trunk, and then they have these spiky leaves that almost look like fronds. They are at risk of extinction. They've been smuggled for as much as $50,000 per plant. I saw an article from the New York Times, if you're interested, about, I think this article was about a sting operation trying to find who was smuggling these plants. Pretty funny. Some of the more common varieties are sold as houseplants. So you may have something that looks like this. My uncle had one, hated it as a kid because you'd run into it and it would like pet you. But they do look pretty cool. Another cool thing about this group of gymnosperms is that this is a plant that has the most flagella and like the biggest sperm within the plant kingdom. I don't actually know, possibly also within animals. I don't know who the winner there is. Should ask doctors later. They have 40,000 flagella on their sperm. I tried to get a picture for you, but it turns out once it's at 40,000, just looks like a big blob, so didn't bother. So it's real wild. And they're not totally sure why it needs 40,000 of them to get into the female structure, but it went all in on those flagella. Too many, right? That seems like an accident to me. Another cool thing about them is that they can fix nitrogen. So nitrogen is a nutrient that plants need. We need it too. But the most nitrogen in the soil is not really bioavailable. Most plants can't bring it up. So we have specific plants that are called nitrogen fixers that are able to convert the type of nitrogen that's in the soil into a type of nitrogen that plants can use. And they do this by having symbiosis with different types of bacteria. So the cycads have a symbiosis with cyanobacteria, so they're protecting these bacteria that they have basically in nodules near their roots that allows them to convert this nitrogen into a usable form. I actually did my research as an undergrad on nitrogen fixation, so this is a favorite topic of mine, but it is important in a lot of environments because if you don't have nitrogen fixers, eventually you just use up all the nitrogen in the soil and plants can't grow. So it's important to have nitrogen fixers present so that you can convert the nitrogen, and then other plants in the surrounding area are also able to use the nitrogen fixed by the nitrogen fixers. So also, here I have another little phylogeny. We're going to see a couple more in the next group as well. But here we see the kind of relationship between some of our gymnosperm groups. So here we have our diversification of seed plants. Here we're in the gymnosperms. We can see that the cycads and the ginkgo are kind of out on their own, at least in this configuration. Right, they really do not look like a pine tree. Recently, the most recent hypothesis is that this next group that we're going to talk about, the gonidophytes, is actually a sister group to the conifers. So the gonidophytes are going to look like even weirder. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth and a lot of debate about how these groups are all related to each other. So the Gonidopsida has really unclear classification. This group doesn't have many synapomorphies, so they don't have really hardly any common characteristics that link them together other than their genetics. So here we see some guesses about, or some different theories about how they're related to each other. So where's the one I like best? Yeah, so the one that we saw on the previous slide, I think is this one. So this is called the Gymnosperm hypothesis, which has gymnosperms separating from angiosperms as a group. Then the cycads and the ginkgo doing their own thing. And then the conifers and the gnetophytes as sister groups. But we've had a lot of other hypotheses that are pretty different from this. So they used to think that the ginkgo, the cycads, and the conifers kind of all split off separately from the angiosperms and the gnetophytes. So in this configuration, really the gnetophytes weren't part of our gymnosperms at all, really in a phylogenetic sense. Now we have another hypothesis that specifically the gnetophytes are related to specifically the pine family. Seems a little crazy, but there is some molecular evidence that supports this as well. And then they used to also think that gnetophytes just branched off separately very early. And then the separation of angiosperms from these other three groups within our gymnosperms happened later. So lots of arguments. And then there are also arguments within this group about what you count as a genus, you know, exactly what's related to what. We don't have a definitive answer. You don't have to learn a definitive answer, but it's an area of kind of ongoing research. So one of our examples in this group is the genus Ephedra. So Ephedra is usually a shrub. And when people talk about Ephedra, which is not all that often, the reason they're usually talking about it is that it's helpful medicinally. So ephedrine and pseudoephedrine are derived from this plant. So its earliest use for illness that we have documented is back to 5000 BC, right? So it's a part of traditional medicine. It has effects on your sympathetic nervous system. It has decongestant qualities. So like pseudoephedrine is contained in a lot of decongestants. You have to get it behind the counter. Back in the day, they also used to have a lot of supplements of ephedrine for weight loss because it increases your metabolic rate. Unfortunately, several deaths and heart attacks and even some psychiatric episodes were linked to use of these supplements. So ephedrine as a supplement is now banned, although there are some exceptions for like traditional teas and stuff. So specifically as a supplement. So still in this group, looking quite different, is our world's ugliest plant, according to some guy on the internet. This is our Welwitschia. So some individuals are up to 1500 years old. And the thing I think is crazy about this plant, that everything you see here is actually only 2 leaves. So it grows up as basal leaves, right? So 2 of them, just like out to the sides. So basal leaves are the ones that are just like kind of at the bottom, right? So that's it. And then these grow and grow and grow, but they're growing in deserts. So we have really high wind forces. We've been around for 15,000 years in that desert. So these 2 leaves get split by the wind, giving us this crazy looking plants. They are evergreen. If you wanted to go find one, you find them in the desert in Namibia and Angola. There actually is a tourist industry to take you out to see these Welwitschia for all you plant tourists out there. If you were going to go see this plant, you would go to Namibia. The plants in Angola are better protected, and this helps for conservation purposes. We're not worried about the conservation of the Welwitschia. Unfortunately, because of the Angolan Civil War, there are a high concentration of landmines in the environment where we have these Welwitschia. So nobody is going to go risk landmines to find this plant. I'm not. I hope not. Another trivia fact about this plant is that the guy who first went from Europe to Namibia and Angola to see this plant, wanted to give it the name Timboa after what the local people called it. But Joseph Hooker, who was one of Darwin's friends, decided that instead they should just name it after this Austrian guy who found it and described it, which is kind of lame. Oh. All right, so I felt like that picture didn't do it justice, so we're gonna take a little tour of the Welwitschia.
As is the case the world over, the physical adaptations of the flora and fauna are often representative of the environment they inhabit. We have learned that many highly adapted plants lead to tender presence. One endemic to the number defies the ordinary. It is so unusual, yet perfectly adapted. Welwitschia mirabilis, a true living fossil. The interesting thing about Welwitschia is that the leaves seem to break the rules for what we would predict these sizes of plants that to be. So there's quite a bit of work been done to predict the relationship between environment and leaf size. And one of the conclusions from that work is that if you have a plant that's in a hot, sunny environment, it should produce leaves small and narrow. There's Welwitschia, it breaks the rules. These large leaves, when you're dealing with a healthy, intact plant, provides an enormous patch of shade and shelter underneath it. This is a phenomenon that's called niche construction. That's an organism actually building an environment and another environment. So you have these patches of shadiness and relatively cool temperatures under the canopy of the Welwitschia. And this might not only help the Welwitschia, for example, cooler temperatures, where there's higher humidity, but less demand for water, things to do what they need to do. But it can also provide a shelter for other organisms. This is a relatively unexplored area. In part, it's because niche construction is a relatively new way of thinking about adaptation and evolution. And this may be why Welwitschia use rules. The evolution of the angiosperms, the flowering plants, took place at the beginning of the Mesozoic period, some 250 million years ago. This period was when the amphibian dominance of the Earth started to fade and the reptiles began to emerge. About a third of the way through the Mesozoic, the dinosaurs began to emerge, and it is widely believed that Welwitschia came into existence around this time.
It emerged first that we know from fossil evidence around about 200 million years. People believe that they found Welwitschia fossils in the sort of roundabout deposits. They recognize the flowers, they recognize the cones, and they recognize the pollen that's in those deposits.
Today, Welwitschia is found only in the desert. The Brazilian fossils, however, are evidence of the plant's primordial existence, first growing in the time prior to the existence of the Atlantic Ocean. South America and Africa were once connected in a vast continental area known as Gondwana. Around 130 million years ago, the gigantic landmass gradually broke up to form the Atlantic Ocean, separating populations of plants and animals. In this now extinct supervolcano, known as Mesa Crater, many large and most presumably ancient specimens of Welwitschia can be found. lichens cling to this giant, which stands almost 6 feet tall. Notoriously difficult to date, no one truly knows the age of any Robertia specimens. Although scientists have estimated that a plant this size could be over 2,000 years old. Clearly, the adaptations of this extraordinary plant species have served it well throughout the ages.
Super weird looking, but also pretty cool. Okay, so our last group within our gymnosperms are Gymnetium. So Gymnetium are related to the Ephedra and the Lobetia. They have a lot more examples. So they come as trees, they come as shrubs, they also come as vines. So the word liana really just means a vine. It's a more technical term. But a weird thing about them is kind of like the geckos. They look a lot like angiosperms. So if you were to see one and you didn't know that Gymnetium was a gymnosperm, you probably wouldn't guess it. This is because they have a bunch of specializations, which otherwise we really only see in the angiosperms. One of these things is associated with the xylem. So the xylem in Gymnetium and in angiosperms has a type of tissue called a vessel element. So the vessel element helps it distribute the water, but you see it in no other gymnosperms. Another thing that they do that's kind of weird and is a known characteristic of angiosperms is they undergo something called double fertilization. When we talk about angiosperm life cycles, we'll go a little more into that. Kind of strange that we see it in the Gymnetium as well. So here's just kind of what that looks like. You can see that their cones are real weird. Kind of cool. So that's really it for our gymnosperms, and we'll practice looking at these gymnosperms a little more closely on Thursday. And I just pulled out some of the terms that you want to make sure to be familiar with when it eventually comes to our next lecture quiz test thing.